The frost had come early that year, and it had come to stay. It settled first on the rooftops of the town, then crept down the chimney pots, then found its way through the seams of doors that no longer shut quite true. And by the time December arrived, it had claimed every window in every house on Willow Lane as its own. The town itself seemed to have grown smaller with the cold, as though it were an old woman drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. And the people in it had grown quieter too, as if speech itself were a fire that could not be spared. Fewer candles burned in the windows that winter. Fewer carts rattled down the frozen lane. Fewer voices called out greetings across the square, where the fountain had long since stopped its summer song and now stood choked with ice, a monument to a warmth no one quite remembered. In the smallest house at the end of that lane, in a room barely large enough for a bed and a chair and a basket of half-mended lace, Miss Eleanor Vane sat very still, with her hands in her lap, and did the sum again, though she already knew the answer, and the answer had not changed since the last time she had done it. Nor would it change, no matter how many times she asked it to. 4 coins. 4 coins to last until the spring positions opened, if they opened at all, and cold enough for perhaps a fortnight if she was careful. And she was always careful. Carefulness being the one luxury poverty had never managed to take from her. She had not always counted coins. There had been a house once, with a mother in it, and a father whose ledgers had been full instead of empty, and a childhood that had not known what it meant to go without. But houses could be lost as easily as they were built, and fathers could die owing more than they had ever owned, and mothers could follow not long after from a grief that had nowhere else to go. And a girl of 19 could find herself, in the space of 2 winters, entirely alone in the world, with nothing to her name but a grey wool cloak, a box of needles, and a patience she had not asked for, but had learned to wear as armor. She mended lace for the wives of men who had once called her father friend. She did not resent it. Resentment, she had found, cost more than it returned, and she had nothing left to spend on it. What she had instead was a discipline of the eyes. She did not look too long at the warm windows of the inn as she passed, nor at the baker's tray of bread still steaming in the cold air, nor at the fine carriages that occasionally rattled through the town on their way to somewhere grander. She looked at her work. She looked at the road ahead of her feet. She looked, on Sundays, at the worn stone floor of the parish church, where she went not because she believed God owed her anything in particular, but because the church was warm in its way, and because it was the one place in the town where no one asked her to prove she belonged. It was on such a Sunday, with the frost thick on the church steps and her breath rising in small white clouds before her, that she came to stand before the poor box in the vestibule, as she did every week, and reached into the small cloth purse at her waist. She did not hesitate. That was the strange thing about it, the thing she herself might not have been able to explain if anyone had asked her. She did not hesitate, though the coin in her fingers was the last one she owned, though giving it away meant that Monday would arrive with nothing at all behind it. She had watched an old woman, Widow Coombs, hobble past her not a quarter hour before, her boots worn through at the sole, her hands raw with the cold, and Eleanor had thought only, "Someone must need this more than I do tonight," and had not thought beyond it, because to think beyond it was to begin bargaining with her own conscience, and she had never yet found that a profitable trade. The coin dropped into the box with a small, final sound, and Eleanor drew her grey cloak tighter and turned to go, and did not see, could not have seen, tucked as he was in the shadow of the north aisle, arrived early and unannounced for reasons of his own that had nothing whatsoever to do with charity, the tall, still figure of a man who had watched the entire small transaction from beginning to end, and who had seen, in the moment before she reached into it, the flat and empty look of a purse that held nothing else within it. He said nothing. He did not step forward, did not offer coin of his own, did not do any of the things a lesser sort of man might have done to ease his own conscience at the sight of true want standing so plainly before him. He only watched her go, this narrow, upright young woman in her plain grey cloak, watched the door close behind her with its small complaint of cold hinges, and stood a long moment in the empty church, turning over something in his mind that he could not yet have named, though it would return to him again and again in the weeks that followed, in the small hours when sleep would not come, in the long silent corridors of a house that had forgotten what warmth was for. He was the Duke of Marchmont, and he had come to that church that morning to be alone with a grief none of his neighbours knew the shape of, and he left it instead with a single image lodged in his chest, like a splinter that would not be drawn out. A girl with an empty purse and a full heart, who gave away her last coin without a moment's pause, and who would never know, not for many months yet, that she had been seen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, brought by a rider whose horse was finer than any Eleanor had seen pass through Willow Lane in a 12-month, and whose livery, dark green, trimmed in silver, belonged to no household she recognized. She took the letter with hands that had gone, without her quite noticing, a little unsteady, for letters delivered by liveried riders were not, in her experience, harbingers of good news to women in her situation. They were the instruments of landlords and creditors, of solicitors settling old accounts, of the world reaching into the small, quiet corner where she had made her peace, and reminding her that it had not forgotten her debts, even if it had forgotten everything else about her. She broke the seal, a stag's head pressed into black wax, and read again, and then sat down rather suddenly on the one chair her room possessed, because the words did not, on a first reading, arrange themselves into anything she could quite believe. The letter was from a Mr. Aldous Gray, solicitor, writing on behalf of His Grace, the Duke of Marchmont, and it requested, no, summoned, though it was phrased with excessive courtesy, the presence of Miss Eleanor Vane at the offices of Gray and Fenwick in the county town, at her earliest convenience, on a matter of business that would, the letter assured her, be very much to her advantage. She did not know a Duke of Marchmont. She had never in her life had business worth a solicitor's notice, still less a duke's. She turned the letter over, as though the reverse side might explain the front, found nothing, and spent the better part of that night awake, listening to the wind test the loose shutter above her window, turning the strange sentence over and over, very much to her advantage, as though it were a coin whose true value she could not determine by weight alone. She went, of course. She had 4 coins fewer than nothing to lose by going, and the walk to the county town cost her only the wear of boots already worn. And curiosity, she told herself, was not the same as hope, though she suspected, even as she told herself so, that she was drawing a distinction finer than the truth allowed. Mr. Gray received her in an office that smelled of ink and old leather, and did not keep her waiting, which she took, rightly, as a small courtesy in a world that had shown her few of them lately. He was a spare, careful man, precise in his speech, and he did not waste her time with pleasantries she suspected he did not much believe in either. His Grace, he explained, required a companion. No, he corrected himself at her expression, not quite a companion, though the duties would resemble it in the early months. For his young half-sister, Miss Cecilia Ashworth, a girl of 15, who had lately lost her governess to marriage, and who required, in his Grace's own words, someone of good sense, plain honesty, and no interest whatsoever in fashionable society. The position carried a salary Eleanor did not, at first, believe she had heard correctly, and required residence at Marchmont Hall for a period of not less than 1 year. There was more to it than that, Mr. Gray admitted, when she asked, because she had learned, in 2 years of watching her own fortunes narrow to almost nothing, always to ask what a bargain was not saying aloud. There was, in fact, a clause in the late Duke's will, unusual and binding, that required the present Duke to establish a settled household, a wife, a family, some proof of permanence, before his 30th year, upon pain of forfeiting a portion of the estate to a cousin whose stewardship the late Duke had, apparently, trusted very little. His Grace's 30th year arrived in 11 months. Miss Ashworth's guardianship and much of the estate's future depended upon it. Eleanor sat very still and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to those who have had to understand hard things quickly all their lives, that she was not being offered a position as a governess at all. Or not only that. She was being offered a bargain of an altogether different shape, though Mr. Gray was too careful a man to name it outright in a first meeting, and it was left to her to ask the plain question herself, which she did, because she had never yet found that avoiding a hard truth made it any less true. "You are asking," she said, "whether I would consider marriage." Mr. Gray did not so much as blink. "His Grace asks nothing of the kind, Miss Vane. Not directly. Not yet. He asks only that you come to Marchmont Hall and meet his sister, and see the household, and decide for yourself whether the position, in whatever form it finally takes, suits you. He is not a man who believes in deciding such things by letter." She thought of her 4 coins, spent now to 3, and of the poor box, and of Widow Coomb's worn boots, and of a whole life that had narrowed itself, these 2 years past, to the width of a needle and the length of a winter. She thought, too, that a bargain honestly named was worth 100 romances dishonestly disguised, and that she would rather know exactly what she was agreeing to than be flattered into agreeing to something else entirely. "I will come," she said, "on the condition that whatever is decided, it is decided plainly, and I am not made a fool of in the process." Mr. Gray, for the first time, allowed himself something that was almost a smile. "I believe, Miss Vane, that condition will suit His Grace rather better than you expect." Marchmont Hall received her the way a held breath receives a sudden sound. All at once, and with a kind of shock, the house itself seemed slow to recover from. She arrived in the last grey light of a short winter afternoon, in a hired carriage that seemed to shrink smaller and smaller as the great house rose up before it, until she felt, stepping down onto the frost-white gravel, no larger than the smallest of the needles in her work-box. The house was beautiful, in the particular way that grief is sometimes beautiful. Every line of it correct, every proportion admirable, and every window dark. She counted 12 before she reached the door, and found not one of them lit, though the hour was well past dusk, and she understood, without yet being told, that this was not a house accustomed to receiving anyone it wished to welcome. She was shown into a drawing-room by a housekeeper, whose face was arranged in the particular stillness of a woman determined to give away nothing of her own opinion. And there she waited. And there, after an interval long enough to make plain that she was not a guest whose comfort had been much considered, the Duke of Marchmont came to her. He was younger than she had expected, and colder than she had feared. He was tall and dark, and moved with the economy of a man who had long ago decided that nothing in his life merited more motion than was strictly necessary. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke, and she had the distinct and not entirely comfortable sense of being assessed the way one might assess a horse or a length of cloth, not unkindly, but with no pretense of anything warmer than practical interest. "Miss Vane," his voice matched the rest of him, "you understand the nature of what is being asked of you." "I understand what Mr. Gray has told me of it," she said, and found, to her own faint surprise, that her voice did not shake. "I understand less of what you intend by it." Something crossed his face, not quite surprise, but its cooler cousin, the recognition of an answer he had not expected to receive so plainly. "I intend a marriage of convenience, Miss Vane, nothing more romantic than that, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I require a wife within the year, or my sister's future and half this estate pass into hands that will not trouble to care for either. I do not ask for your affection. I do not offer mine. I ask only for honesty, competence, and discretion. And I'm prepared to pay well for all three." She had imagined, on the long carriage ride, several versions of this conversation, and had armed herself against flattery, against pity, against the particular indignity of being made to feel a charity case dressed up as a bride. She had not quite armed herself against bluntness, and found, turning it over, that she did not mind it half so much as she had expected to. "Then let us be equally honest," she said. "I will not come into this house to be an ornament, Your Grace, nor a ghost that moves through it unremarked. If I am to be your wife, I will be its mistress in truth, not merely in name, and I will speak my mind when I believe it wants speaking, and I will not be dismissed to a wing of this house and forgotten in it. Those are my terms, if terms are what we are exchanging." The Duke regarded her for a long moment, and she thought, though she could not have said what convinced her of it, some faint shift about the eyes, no more, that this was the first time in a great while but anyone had spoken to him as though he were merely a man, and not a title with a man's face attached to it. "Agreed," he said, and that was all, and she understood that a bargain had been struck between them in fewer words than she would once have spent haggling over a length of ribbon, and that the smallness of the ceremony did not make the thing itself any smaller. She met Cecilia the following morning, a bright, watchful girl of 15, who studied Eleanor with the particular suspicion of a child who has been disappointed by adults before and does not intend to be disappointed again, and who said, within the first quarter hour of their acquaintance, "You are not at all what I expected a duchess to look like," in a term that made plain she did not yet know whether this was a compliment. "I have not yet agreed to be a duchess," Eleanor told her with perfect truth. "I have only agreed to stay, and to see whether this house wants staying in." Cecilia considered this with the gravity of a much older person. "It doesn't," she said. "Not for a long while now. But perhaps it might, if someone stayed long enough to remind it how." Eleanor thought of the 12 dark windows, and of the still, cold man who had struck a bargain with her in the language of a business transaction, and of her own 3 remaining coins, now become entirely irrelevant to a future she had not, until this week, known existed. And she thought, perhaps. She did not yet believe it, but she had learned, mending lace stitch by patient stitch through 2 hard winters, that very little worth having arrived all at once, and that perhaps was very often where beginnings quietly began. The house did not surrender its cold all at once, and Eleanor had not expected that it would. She had grown up enough, in her 2 hard winters, to know that houses, like people, did not thaw because someone wished it, only because someone worked at it, patiently, in small, unglamorous increments that no one else troubled to notice until the change was already accomplished. She began, in her first week, with the library, because it was the one room in Marchmont Hall that seemed to her, on first inspection, to still have some life left worth reviving. The shutters had been kept closed there for reasons no servant could quite explain to her. It had simply become the custom, somewhere in the 2 years since the old Duke's death, to leave that room in permanent twilight, as though light itself were an indulgence the house could no longer afford. Eleanor opened the shutters on her 3rd morning, over the faint and wordless disapproval of a housemaid who plainly thought the new arrangement not her place to question aloud, and stood a long moment in the sudden flood of pale winter sun, watching dust turn to gold in the air, and thought, "This, at least, I can mend." She did not ask the Duke's permission for such small acts, having learned already that he noticed everything and remarked on almost nothing. And she suspected, rightly as it turned out, that a man who had agreed to a bargain of plain honesty would respect a woman who acted within her own authority, rather than one who begged leave for every small decision. The household watched her in those early weeks, the the way a wary animal watches an unfamiliar hand. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, with a stiff, correct courtesy that gave nothing away. The younger maids, with a curiosity they were careful to disguise as industry. Old Simmons, the butler, who had served the Marchmont family since before the present Duke could walk, with an expression Eleanor could not read at all, and which she later came to understand was simply grief grown so old it had forgotten how to look like anything else. It was Simmons who first showed her, without meaning to, the shape of the man she had married in all but name. She came upon him one grey afternoon in the stable yard, engaged in quiet conversation with a stable boy of perhaps 10 years, whose father, she later learned, had been thrown from a horse the previous spring and had not walked properly since. The Duke was crouched at the boy's level, a posture so at odds with the cold, upright figure she had met in the drawing-room that she stopped entirely still in the shadow of the archway, unwilling to disturb whatever this was, and was pressing something into the boy's hand, quietly, without the smallest ceremony, and saying words she was too far to hear, but whose tone she understood well enough. Not charity offered from a height, but a kindness given as though it were owed, as though the boy's dignity mattered more than the Duke's own credit for the act. He rose and saw her before she could withdraw, and something closed over his face at once, some shutter drawn as swift and complete as the one she had opened in the library that same week. And she understood that she had seen something he had not intended anyone to see, and that he minded the seeing far more than the kindness itself. "His father cannot work," was all he said, by way of explanation he had not been asked to give. "I did not ask," she said gently. "No," he agreed. "You did not." And something in the way he said it suggested that this, too, the not asking, the not making a spectacle of a private goodness, counted for something with him, though he would not have said so aloud for a great deal of money. She did not speak of it to the household, though she suspected, from small things said and unsaid in the weeks that followed, that she was not the first to glimpse such moments and keep them to herself. She began, instead, in her quiet way, to do the same. Small, unshowy things, a warmer word to a housemaid who had been overlooked, a fire lit in a room that had gone cold for want of anyone remembering it, the vast dining table she was expected to preside over at each solitary dinner, shortened by half, over Mrs. Pemberton's initial and quickly abandoned objections, until two people sitting at opposite ends of a room no longer had to raise their voices to be heard by one another. By the second month, the maids had stopped watching her with suspicion and begun, instead, to bring her small confidences, a worry over a sister's health, a hope for a sweetheart's return from sea, the particular currency of trust that cannot be commanded, only earned, stitch by careful stitch, the same way she had once mended lace for women who had never once asked her name. By the second month, too, the library stood open every morning without her having to say a word about it, and a fire was laid there before she woke, and she understood, with a small private warmth she did not yet examine too closely, that this house, cold as it was, formidable as its master remained, had begun, in its slow and grudging way, to remember how to be lived in. It was on an evening in late January, with sleet ticking softly against the library windows, and the fire burned low and companionable between them, that the Duke first spoke to her of something that was not business. They had fallen, these past weeks, into a habit neither of them had planned nor named. An hour after Cecilia had gone up to bed, spent in the library in a silence that had grown, by careful and unremarked degrees, from awkward to comfortable. He read, she mended or wrote letters, or simply sat with her hands folded, watching the fire, and neither of them had ever remarked upon the fact that two people who had married as strangers now spent their evenings in a silence neither wished to end. "You do not ask me about my father," he said that evening, without preamble, his eyes still on the book he was not, she suspected, truly reading. "I assumed you would tell me, if there were something you wished told." He closed the book. He was not a kind man, Miss Vane. Eleanor. He corrected himself, and she noted the correction and the small effort it plainly cost him, and said nothing to disturb it. He was exacting and cold, and he measured his children's worth by the same ledger he used for his tenants' rents. And I spent 30 years believing that love in this family was simply another word for obligation efficiently discharged. "And the will?" she said quietly. "The clause that brought me here?" "Is his final ledger entry," he said, and with something that was almost, though not quite, a bitter smile. "A last attempt to govern me from beyond the grave. He did not believe I would ever choose a wife for myself. Believed I was too much his own son for that, too cold, too careful. He meant the clause as a punishment, I think, or a test he expected me to fail." He looked up at her then, and something in his face had shifted. Some guard lowered by an inch that she understood had cost him a great deal more than the inch itself suggested. I did not expect, when I agreed to Mr. Gray's absurd proposal, that I would come instead to think it the one instruction of my father's I did not resent obeying. She did not answer at once. She had learned, in the 2 months since her arrival, that this man's silences were not emptiness, but the shape his feeling took when it had nowhere safe to go. And she had learned, too, that the wrong word spoken too quickly could close a door that had taken weeks to open even a little. "My own father," she said instead, "kept a ledger too. He believed the world would reward carefulness and honesty and hard work, in that order and without exception. And he was wrong. And it cost him everything. And cost my mother her life not long after, and left me, at 19, with nothing but a grey cloak and a box of needles, and his same stubborn belief that carefulness and honesty were worth keeping, even when the world had shown me plainly that they were not always rewarded." She looked at him. "I do not think you are your father, Your Grace. I think you have spent a great deal of effort making certain of it, in rooms no one was meant to see." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. Before we go further into what that small, unguarded moment cost him to allow, and what it began to mean for them both, let us pause here for just a moment. If you don't want to miss what happens next, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We'll be right back with the rest of the story. He did not answer her in words. He reached instead for the poker and settled the fire, a small, ordinary motion that gave his hands something to do while his face, for once, did not quite manage its usual stillness, and she understood that she had been given, in that unguarded half-smile, something rarer from this man than any speech, however fine, could have offered her. "Julian," he said after a moment, so quietly she almost missed it beneath the settling of the coals. "My name, when we are alone. I find I would rather hear it in your voice than in Mr. Gray's correspondence." "Julian," she said, testing the shape of it, and found that it fit her mouth more easily than she would have guessed a month before, when he had been, to her, only a cold title with a colder face attached. "Then you must call me Eleanor, and not Miss Vane, when we are alone as we are now." He looked at her a long moment across the low fire, and did not smile fully, not yet, not that night, but the almost had become, in the space of that single conversation, something neither of them any longer pretended not to notice. It could not last, of course, that quiet, unremarked thawing, because the world beyond Marchmont Hall's gates had not forgotten that a duke so eligible and so long unmarried was, by every rule of that world's arithmetic, a prize still worth competing for. And there were those in it who had counted on winning that particular competition long before a plain, penniless girl from a fading market town had ever been heard of. Chief among them was Lady Caroline Vance, a celebrated beauty of the county, whose fortune was nearly as considerable as her certainty that the Duke of Marchmont had been, in some unspoken but entirely understood arrangement, promised to her by the natural order of things, by birth, by beauty, by the simple fact that she had never in her life encountered an ambition she considered beneath fulfilling. She had known the Duke since childhood, had danced with him at every assembly for a decade, and had watched, with an outrage she took no particular trouble to disguise, the announcement of his sudden and inexplicable marriage to a woman nobody in the county had ever so much as heard mentioned before that winter. Her first visit to Marchmont Hall, undertaken under the perfectly correct pretext of welcoming the new Duchess to the neighborhood, was a masterclass in the particular cruelty that wears the face of good manners. She admired the drawing-room's new arrangement in a tone that made plain she found it provincial. She asked Eleanor searching questions about her family, her connections, her education, each one delivered with a smile so pleasant that only its precision, each question aimed with surgical care at the exact places where Eleanor's history offered nothing to boast of, revealed its true purpose. She remarked, as she took her leave, upon how very fortunate it was that His Grace had found someone so— She paused, as if searching honestly for the kindest word. So practical, in the end. Eleanor bore it without visible flinching, because she had spent 2 winters learning that the surest way to survive an insult delivered in company was never to let the company see it land. But she felt it nonetheless, in the old, familiar place where 2 years of poverty had already worn her thin. And she did not speak of the visit to Julian, not wishing to burden a fragile new peace with a grievance he could do nothing immediate to mend. But snubs, when they are not answered, tend only to embolden the one who delivers them, and Lady Caroline's second campaign was considerably less subtle than her first. Within a fortnight, a rumour had begun making its way through the drawing-rooms of the county, quietly at first, then with the particular speed reserved for gossip too delicious to sit on, that the new Duchess of Marchmont was no gentlewoman fallen on hard times at all, but an adventuress, a fortune huntress who had somehow contrived, through means unspecified but darkly implied, to entrap a duke desperate enough for an heir to overlook her want of birth, breeding, or honest character. Eleanor heard the whisper first from Mrs. Pemberton, who brought it to her with obvious reluctance and even more obvious loyalty, and then, more painfully, from Cecilia, who came to her in tears one evening, having heard a version of it repeated, not unkindly, but not gently either, by a schoolroom acquaintance whose mother had clearly not troubled to lower her voice at the appropriate moment. "They are saying dreadful things," Cecilia said, "and I do not know how to make them stop saying them, and I hate that I do not know how." "You cannot make people stop talking, my dear," Eleanor told her, drawing the girl close, "any more than you can make the wind stop simply by wishing it. What you can do, what we can both do, is refuse to let their talk decide what is true." "But what if it does?" Cecilia asked, with the particular bluntness of a girl of 15 who had not yet learned to soften her fears into more comfortable shapes. "What if enough people say a thing, often enough, that it stops mattering whether it was ever true at all?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, as it deserved. "Then we will simply have to be more patient than the talk is," she said. "I have found, in my own life, that lies move quickly but do not last, while the truth moves slowly and outlasts everything that was ever said against it. It is not a comfortable arithmetic, when you are the one waiting on it, but I have never yet known it to fail entirely, given time enough." Cecilia did not look wholly reassured, but she nodded and pressed closer, and Eleanor held her a while longer in the quiet of the nursery, listening to the fire settle, thinking that this, too, was a kind of work no less demanding than mending lace by candlelight, the slow, patient work of teaching a girl that dignity did not require the world's permission to remain intact. But she felt it more than she let Cecilia see, that old, cold weight of being judged by people who had never troubled to know her, and she felt, too, a new and sharper fear beneath it, not for herself alone now, but for what such talk, left unanswered, might yet cost Julian, whose fragile new household, so recently and so carefully thawed, stood exposed before a world only too glad to see it freeze again. It was Julian who came to her, when at last the whispers reached even his careful ears, and his face, when he found her, was not cold at all, but lit with an anger she had not yet seen in him, and which she understood at once was not directed at her. "I will not have it," he said. "Whatever else I am, I will not have my wife slandered in drawing rooms by a woman whose only grievance is that I did not marry her instead." "It will pass," Eleanor said, though she did not entirely believe it. "Talk generally does in time." "Not this," he said, "not left unanswered. I have let this family hide behind closed shutters for 2 years, Eleanor, and I will not let it hide now, when there is finally something in it worth defending openly." The Marchmont ball had not been held in 3 years, not since the old Duke's final illness had closed the house to company entirely, and its revival that spring, announced within days of Julian's quiet, resolved anger, sent a ripple of anticipation through a county that had grown thoroughly hungry for both entertainment and answers. Everyone understood, without its being said aloud, that this would be no ordinary evening. Everyone understood that the new Duchess would, for the first time, stand fully exposed before the very society that had spent a month deciding, in her absence, precisely what she was. Eleanor dressed that evening in a gown of deep, unshowy blue. No ornament, no borrowed grandeur, nothing that pretended to a fashion she had never claimed, and stood a long moment before her glass with Mrs. Pemberton fussing gently at a stray pin, thinking of a girl in a grey wool cloak who had once counted 4 coins and found them wanting, and wondering whether that girl would recognize the woman looking back at her now, and deciding, on reflection, that she would, because nothing essential in her had actually changed, only the room around her, and the man who now stood, waiting, at the foot of the stairs. Julian met her at the bottom of them, and did not compliment her gown, nor her hair, nor any of the small vanities a lesser man might have reached for in that moment, but took her hand, and said only, low enough for her alone, "Whatever is said tonight, you are not alone in it." And she found that this, from him, was worth 100 prettier speeches. The ballroom, restored to full candlelight for the first time in years, glittered with a warmth Eleanor suspected the house had nearly forgotten it was capable of holding. And for the first hour, the evening proceeded as such evenings do. Introductions, dancing, the low murmur of a county reacquainting itself with the household it had assumed, wrongly, was done with joy. But Lady Caroline had not come to admire the candlelight, and her campaign, having been permitted to simmer unanswered for a month, had reached the boil she had always intended it to reach. She chose her moment with the precision of a general, waiting until the dancing had paused, until enough of the room's attention had gathered naturally in one place, until Eleanor stood near enough to the center of the floor that no retreat could be managed without spectacle. And then she spoke, pitched to Carrie, wrapped still in the pleasant tones of concerned society, but leaving no doubt, this time, of her true intent. "I do wonder, Your Grace," she said, addressing Julian but looking pointedly at Eleanor, "whether anyone here has troubled to inquire properly into your Duchess's history before the wedding. It seems remarkable, does it not, how very conveniently a penniless young woman of no connections came to secure so very great a prize, and how very little any of us actually know of where she came from or what she wanted from it." The room, as such rooms do, went still all at once, the particular stillness of an audience that senses a performance approaching its climax and does not intend to miss a word of it. Eleanor felt the old, cold weight settle over her, the familiar instinct to make herself smaller, quieter, less visible to a room that had already decided what to see, and then felt, beside her, Julian's hand close briefly, deliberately, over her own, and understood that he did not intend, this time, to let the room decide anything at all. He stepped forward, and the candlelight caught his face. and every person in that glittering room fell silent to hear a duke who had not, in 3 years, troubled to defend anything publicly, prepare now to defend the one thing he had come, in this quiet, unglamorous season, to value above all the rest of it. "I did not marry my wife for convenience," he said, and his voice, though not raised, carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room, with the particular authority of a man who has stopped caring, at last, whether his private feelings are thought proper to display in public. "I did not marry her because a clause in my father's will demanded I find a wife within the year, though I will not pretend that clause did not bring her to this house. I married her because in the 2 months since she arrived here, she has done what neither my father's fortune nor my own careful management ever managed to do. She has made this house a home again." He turned, slowly, so that his words reached not only Lady Caroline, but every guest, arranged in careful attention around the room's edge. "I chose her not for her birth, for she has told me plainly she claims none worth boasting of. I chose her not for her fortune, for she arrived at my door with 4 coins to her name, and gave the last of them to a poor box before ever she knew I existed. I chose her for her honesty, which has never once wavered, even when a comfortable silence would have served her better. I chose her for her courage, which faced a house 12 windows dark, and did not flinch from a single one of them. I chose her, in the end, for exactly the qualities this room seems most determined to hold against her, for asking for nothing, and giving everything, and never once expecting to be thanked for it." He paused, and let the silence hold a moment longer than courtesy strictly required, because he wanted every person in that room to sit inside it, to feel the particular weight of a duke who had never once, in 3 years, troubled himself to correct a rumor, now troubling himself considerably. "I have watched this county's opinion of my family darken and lighten by turns for the whole of my life. And I confess I stopped some years ago, minding very much which way it turned. I find I mind a great deal more, now that it is my wife's name being weighed in the balance, rather than my own. I would ask you all to consider what it says of a woman that in 2 short months, in a house she had never seen before, she reopened a library that had stood shuttered for 2 years, revived a garden left to ruin, and won the trust of a household that does not give its trust lightly or quickly to anyone. I would ask you to consider, too, what it says of the woman who has spent the better part of a season inventing a scandal instead." He looked, at last, directly at Lady Caroline, and his voice, when he continued, lost none of its evenness, though its edge had sharpened considerably. "As for the question of what my wife wanted from this marriage, I can answer that more precisely than any rumor has managed. She wanted honesty, and she has given rather more of it in 2 short months than this room has managed to offer her in return. I would ask that anyone who wishes to continue discussing my wife's character do so to my face, as she has always been willing to speak plainly to mine, rather than in corners, dressed up as concern for a household but requires no one's concern but its own." The silence that followed was not the silence of a scandal narrowly averted, but the different, heavier silence of a scandal that has abruptly changed direction and now threatens to fall in its entirety upon the one who had lit its fuse. Lady Caroline's composure, so carefully maintained through a month of whispered campaigns, did not survive a public reckoning she had not anticipated needing to survive, and she withdrew from Marchmont Hall that night, and from the county's good opinion not long after, having discovered too late that a rumour aimed at an undefended target is a very different weapon from one aimed at a woman a duke has decided, publicly and finally, to defend. There were those in the room who murmured, in the days that followed, that his grace had been unnecessarily severe with the lady of good family, and there were others, considerably more numerous, who remarked only that they had never before seen the Duke of Marchmont speak with such open feeling on any subject at all, and that whatever else might be said of the new Duchess, she had plainly done what 3 years of solitude had not. She had given the man back something of his own voice. The county's opinion, so recently and so eagerly turned against Eleanor, began that same week its slow reversal. Not because anyone issued a correction, but because a room full of witnesses had seen, with their own eyes, precisely what sort of defense true regard is willing to mount, and precisely what sort of accusation cannot survive daylight once it is made to stand in it. Eleanor stood very still through all of it, her hand still resting where Julian had placed it, feeling something loosen in her chest that she had carried, she realized only now, since the night 2 winters before, when she had watched her mother's coffin lowered into frozen ground, and understood that she was, from that moment, entirely alone in defending herself against a world that owed her nothing. She was not alone now. She had not, perhaps, been entirely alone for some weeks, but it took a room full of candlelight and a duke's plain, unglamorous speech to make her finally believe it. They did not speak of it again that night until the guests had gone, until the candles had guttered low, until the great house had settled back into the particular hush it wore after company, a hush that no longer felt, to Eleanor, anything like the cold silence that had greeted her on her first arrival months before. She found him in the library, where she had somehow known she would find him, standing before the low fire with his back to the door, and he turned when he heard her, and did not, this time, close any shutter over his face at being seen in an unguarded moment. "You did not have to say all of that," she told him quietly, coming to stand beside him at the hearth. "You could have answered her more simply. A denial would have served." "A denial would have been a lie," he said. "I did not marry you for convenience, Eleanor. I told myself I did, in the beginning, because it was easier to call it a transaction than to admit what I had actually begun to want from it. But a transaction does not account for how empty this house feels to me now on the evenings you are not in this room. A transaction does not explain why I found myself, 3 weeks ago, rearranging my whole day simply to be certain of an hour by this fire with you in it. What we have built here is not a transaction, whatever bargain first brought us to it. It is a life. I did not expect, when Mr. Gray proposed his absurd arrangement, that I would come to want nothing in this world so much as I want to go on building it with you." She did not answer him at once, because her throat had closed around something she had not expected to feel so suddenly and so entirely. Not triumph, though the evening had certainly been a triumph of a kind, but a warmth so complete it left very little room for a moment for speech. "I did not cry," she said finally, half to herself. "Not once in 2 years of losing everything I had ever had. I told myself it was a kind of strength, to hold it all so still. I am not certain now that it was strength at all. I think perhaps it was only that I had no one yet worth crying in front of." "And now?" he asked very quietly. "Now," she said, and found that her eyes had at last, after 2 long, careful years, filled with tears she did not trouble to hide from him, "I find I have someone." He drew her close then, and there was nothing careful or measured in it, none of the cold precision that had marked their first meeting in this same room months before. Only the plain, unguarded relief of 2 people who had each spent years believing themselves built for solitude, and had discovered, slowly and almost against their own will, that they had been wrong. "Eleanor," he said, against her hair, and her name in his voice no longer sounded like the careful correction of a business arrangement, but like something he had been wanting for weeks to say, simply for the pleasure of the sound of it. "I love you. Not for what this marriage secured me, and not for what my father's will demanded of me, but for exactly what I told that room tonight. For your honesty, your courage, and the particular grace with which you have never once expected to be thanked for either. "I love you," she answered, and the words came easily, without the hesitation she might once have expected of herself, because she had learned this past season that some truths, like the coin dropped so readily into a poor box, cost nothing at all to give away, once you understood, finally, that you had more than enough to spare. They stayed a long while by the fire that night, saying little more, needing little more said. The particular quiet between them, no longer the guarded silence of two strangers taking each other's measure, but the settled quiet of two people who had finally stopped bracing themselves against the possibility of being left. Somewhere above them, Cecilia slept soundly in a room that had, this past season, filled at last with the ordinary noise of a family, rather than the hush of a house in mourning for itself. And somewhere beyond the library windows, the garden Eleanor had coaxed back to life through a long, patient spring lay dark and quiet under a sky finally clear of the winter's clouds. Julian would say, in later years, that he could name the exact evening his father's cold ledger of obligations had been quietly, finally closed, and a different account opened in its place. One measured not in duty efficiently discharged, but in an hour by a low fire, freely given and freely returned. 1 year, almost to the week, from the morning she had stood in a frost-bitten church and given away her last coin without a second thought, Eleanor stood again in that same parish church, though the season now was spring rather than deep winter, and the frost that had claimed every window of the town the year before had long since surrendered to a warmth the whole county seemed, at last, glad to remember. She had come, as she always did, to the poor box in the vestibule, though her purse now held rather more than 4 coins, and she gave, as she always did, without pausing to calculate what the giving cost her, because some habits, once truly learned, do not depend on scarcity to keep them alive. Beside her stood Cecilia, 16 now, and taller for it, and it was Cecilia who slipped her own small coin into the box beside Eleanor's, without being asked, having learned the habit as thoroughly as if she had been raised to it from the cradle. Outside in the churchyard, Julian waited with the particular patience of a man who no longer needed to hide how glad he was to be waiting. And Eleanor, coming out into the bright spring light, thought of the 12 dark windows that had greeted her a year before, and found, when she pictured Marchmont Hall now, that she could no longer summon that darkness at all. Only the library, open to the morning sun every day since her arrival, and the garden, revived from 2 years of neglect into a riot of new green, and the great dining table, still kept at half its former length, where two people who had once been strangers to each other now sat close enough each evening to speak without raising their voices. Widow Combs, older now and slower on her feet, but no longer wanting for a warm coat or a full larder, for Eleanor had seen quietly this past year that no one in the parish who had once gone without would go without again, not while it lay in her power to prevent it, nodded to her from across the churchyard, and Eleanor nodded back and thought that this too was a kind of circle closing. The same kindness she had once given without hope of return now returned to her 100-fold, though she had never once given it expecting repayment. "You are smiling," Julian said, coming to take her arm as they walked from the church. "At nothing at all that I can see." "At everything," she said, "at all of it. A year ago I stood in that church with 4 coins to my name and gave away the last of them, certain I had nothing left to lose, because I had already lost everything worth losing. I did not know that morning that I was being watched by a duke who could not stop thinking of an empty purse for weeks afterward. I did not know that morning, he said, that I had just watched the one person in this county who would ever make me believe a cold house could be warmed again." He drew her hand more securely through his arm as they walked, unhurried, toward the carriage waiting at the churchyard gate. Cecilia caught up to them at the gate, breathless and pleased with herself, having stopped to press a coin of her own into the hand of a barefoot boy selling violets by the churchyard wall. And Eleanor, watching her, thought that this too was a kind of inheritance. Not land, not title, not the vast, cold ledger the old duke had once believed was the only worth a family could pass down, but this quieter one instead. The habit of noticing who stood in need and not waiting to be asked before offering what could be spared. It would outlast the house, she thought, and the title, and even the both of them, passed on now to a girl who had once wept over unkind whispers and had learned, in the year since, that the truest answer to unkindness was simply to keep on being kind regardless. They rode home together as the spring light lengthened over the fields, past hedgerows coming green, past the mill wheel turning steady in a stream no longer choked with ice, toward a house that no longer counted its windows by how many stood dark, toward a life that had begun. However, neither of them could quite have predicted it that frozen December morning, with nothing more than a single coin given away without a second thought. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We would love to know which city you're watching from tonight and what this story made you feel. Please leave us a comment and let us know. And if you don't want to miss any of our new stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time.